She woke up with a purple arm. Every day. And every time I asked her what had happened, she'd stare into space and say in that weak voice, "It must have been in my sleep. I must have scratched myself." But I knew it wasn't just that. It was as if she couldn't explain it herself, or as if she was afraid to. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a fingernail scratch. These were deep, round, recurring marks, and they seemed to get worse every day. The cruelest part was when the nurse, a girl named Vanessa, cold as stone, looked me in the face and said, "She's old. Old people do scratch themselves, Mrs. Eleanor. These spots are a sign of age." And he turned his back, as if I were a hysterical old woman seeing ghosts. My own son, the same one who begged me to accept that nurse, also said I was exaggerating. That it was just my head making things up. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair next to my mother's bed, my heart aching, and I felt like something terrible was happening, right under our roof, and that no one was listening. But I've never been the kind of woman to bow her head. Not when I was left with 2 small children, not when I had to do laundry to put food on the table. And now, at 73, it was no different. I knew something was wrong. And if no one else was going to help me understand, then I was going to figure it out myself. It was then by chance, while rummaging through my mother's old things, that I found a box of black and white photos. Some were a little yellowed, others were out of focus. But one of them, one in particular, made me freeze. It was a photo of my grandmother, taken in a hospital in 1954. She was in a nightgown, with a tired look in her eyes, and on her arm, in exactly the same place on my mother's body, was a mark. The same mark. The same color, the same shape. Then, everything changed. In that moment, I realized that what was hurting my mother wasn't new. It was old. It was a cycle. It was a truth hidden for decades, and that, for some reason, was trying to repeat itself now, with me alive, seeing it all up close. From that moment on, I promised myself I would find out the truth, even if it was the last thing I did. And when I did, someone would pay for this. Because no one hurts my mother. No one. Subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from, because this story isn't just mine. It's all of ours. The next morning, something strange happened. The nurse arrived earlier than usual. She carried a bag that no one could see inside. And when she saw me in the hallway, holding my grandmother's photo, her face changed. She turned pale. She stammered something about needing to leave early. And for the first time, she looked down at me. That's when I realized. She knew. She knew something. And from that moment on, everything I thought was an exaggeration started to make sense. I just didn't realize how far this truth would take me. I live with my mother, Mrs. Norma. She's 94. I'm 73. I'm no longer young, but I've never let anyone tell me when to stop caring for the ones I love. Our house is small, old, full of creaky corners and memories that sometimes seem more alive than the 2 of us. It smells of coffee brewed at the wrong time, lavender soap, and cornmeal cake that only tastes right when the weather turns cold. It's a house that listens. And lately, it's been listening a lot. My routine is made up of silences and small, familiar sounds. The sound of the kettle, the rocking chair on the floor, the clink of a spoon in a teacup. These are things that fill the void, but they don't fill the absence of answers. Donor Norma hardly speaks anymore. Sometimes she murmurs names no one knows, or repeats phrases that seem like fragments from another era, as if time inside her were jumbled. But I recognize every gesture, every look, as if it were a map. And it was this map that alerted me that something was out of place. Ever since she started waking up with strange marks on her body, everything changed. I became more alert. I started waking up in the middle of the night for no reason. I started asking too many questions. And I realized that every time I insisted on understanding, Vanessa, the nurse my son hired, became colder, more evasive. She's one of those people who seems too proper, you know? Clean uniform, tied up hair, neutral tone of voice. But her eyes, Her eyes always seemed too cold for someone who cares for sick people. Vanessa spends the whole day here. She takes care of my mother's medications, prepares them, organizes the schedule. At first glance, you do everything right. But it's in the details that the truth lies. And sometimes, details only appear to those who pay attention. I noticed that, on certain days, my mother was more confused than usual. Her eyes were heavy, her speech slower, as if she were being pulled into herself. At first, I thought it was age fatigue. But after I saw the marks, I couldn't ignore them anymore. It was as if something or someone was stealing what little lucidity she had left. Memories of my childhood came flooding back. I remembered how my mother taught me to cook, with that tough but sweet way. She said the secret to fluffy rice was taking her time. I remembered the Christmases when she insisted on putting up the tree herself, even with her fingers aching from arthritis. I remembered the times she defended me from my father, even trembling with fear. Dona Norma had always been a strong woman. The kind of woman who wouldn't let injustice slide. And now, seeing her so fragile, so silent, so hurt, it tore me apart. I started cooking more, as a way to stay close. I'd make her favorite dish, mashed potatoes with shredded chicken, and wait for some reaction. A smile, a tasty, anything. But she just ate in silence, as if the food no longer had any taste, or as if her body was there, but her soul was somewhere far away. And I wondered, does she feel it? Does she know what's happening? With each passing day, I felt the answer closer. It was as if the truth were hidden in the small gestures of everyday life. In the way Vanessa adjusted the sheets, in the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't looking. And it was in this daily interaction, in these silent behind-the-scenes moments, that I began to piece together a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. I've never been a woman to settle for less. I've always prided myself on being firm, even when the world told me women like me should just accept it. But now it wasn't about me. It was about my mother. About dignity. About a pain that perhaps wasn't just hers. And when I saw that photo of my grandmother, with the same mark, on the same side, on the same arm, I knew it went far beyond Vanessa. It was an old wound. A bitter legacy. A hidden truth that someone tried to erase. But there are things that time doesn't erase. There are pains that span generations, waiting for someone to have the courage to hear what they're trying to say. And I decided I would be that person. Even though I was tired. Even though I was alone. Even though I didn't know exactly what I was going to find. Because the worst pain isn't the one that hurts you. It's the one that silences you. And I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. That afternoon, while washing the lunch dishes, I heard the doorbell ring earlier than usual. It was Vanessa. As cold as ever, but with a different look in her eyes. She seemed tense, uncomfortable. And when he entered, I realized he was carrying something hidden in his bag. It was the first time I sensed she was afraid. And there, in the middle of that kitchen full of memories, something inside me began to stir. She walked through the door as if nothing was out of place. But I could feel it. Even before she said anything, her body spoke louder than words. There was something in the way she clutched her bag to her chest, as if hiding a secret. She avoided my gaze, her steps shorter, as if the floor of our house had become uncomfortable for her. That's when I knew. Something was about to surface. The routine continued, at least on the surface. Vanessa continued with her usual care, at least the ones I could see. She changed the sheets, adjusted the pillows, and prepared the medication with the same clinical precision. But now, everything seemed too choreographed. As if every movement had been rehearsed, as if she knew she was being watched. And she was. Her every gesture was a piece in my puzzle. And I was getting closer and closer to completing the picture. My mother kept waking up with marks. And it wasn't just one or the other. It was as if each day was a reminder. Something was being done to her while everyone turned their heads. Sometimes they were small bruises, other times deeper, almost purple. Always on the same arm. Always in the same pattern. Vanessa kept repeating the same phrase. She scratches herself in her sleep. And she said it with the calm of someone reading a prescription. Soulless. Without shock. As if hurting a frail elderly woman were an insignificant detail. I tried to show my son the marks. He stopped by one Saturday afternoon, between meetings. He looked at them, grimaced slightly, and said, "Mom, you're exaggerating. It's normal. She's almost 100 years old. Her skin is thin. Anything makes a mark." I tried to insist, showing him the sequence of lesions, even showing him a photo of Grandma with the same mark. He looked at it for 3 seconds and replied, "You're trying too hard, Mom. That could be a coincidence." And he left. He kissed Grandma on the forehead, said he had some things to take care of, and left. That hurt more than the marks. Because to me, it was as if he'd chosen not to see. As if ignoring the truth was more comfortable than facing what was right in front of him. And that choice, that omission, carries a silent pain that can't be explained. When your own family decides not to believe you, when the people you raised choose to doubt what you feel, it hurts in a way no mark on your body can. I started recording everything. I took photos of the injuries, wrote down the times, the days, even my mother's reactions. I did this in silence. Because I realized that, in this kind of journey, sometimes the greatest transformation happens when you stop trying to convince others and start trusting your own eyes. My mother, even when quiet, gave me signs. A slight tremor when Vanessa approached. A heavier sigh after the medication. A squeeze on my hand, as if to say, "Help me," even without saying anything. And I listened. Because love is also this, knowing how to hear what's left unsaid. Vanessa continued acting as if everything was normal. And maybe it was, for her. Maybe this was her normal. Operating in the shadows, hurting where no one sees, hiding behind protocols. But there's one thing these people always forget. A hidden truth I've learned from life. What's done in the dark eventually comes to light. And in this house, where every wall carries memory, where every portrait has a story, no lie lasts long. One morning she arrived late. About half an hour. She said the bus had broken down. But the thing is, she came with another bag. A smaller one. More discreet. And she went straight to my mother's room, without going through the kitchen, without greeting me. I followed her, without making a sound. And I saw her take something out of her bag and hide it in the dresser drawer. I couldn't see what it was at the time. But I recorded the gesture. I recorded the sound of the wood being pushed. I recorded the nervousness in her fingertips. When she left the room, she found me in the hallway. I said good morning as if I hadn't seen anything. And for the first time, she smiled. But it was a crooked smile. From the corner of her mouth. Almost a warning. And I took it as a game. But I'm not one to lose easily. Especially when the one at risk is my mother. From then on, I began to observe the scenes more clearly. The way she avoided leaving the bedroom door open. The way he looked away when I entered the room unannounced. And my mother's behavior changed too. She became sleepier, more distant. As if you were losing yourself inside. And it was at that point that the pain became urgent. Because it wasn't just about marks on her skin anymore. It was about erasing her lucidity. It was about slowly taking away the woman who raised me. I knew I needed to do something. And fast. But I also knew it couldn't be impulsive. The decision had to be accurate. Because now it wasn't just a matter of proving myself right. It was a matter of stopping this from going any further. Because something told me that Vanessa hadn't yet shown all she was capable of. He had a day when everything was quieter than usual. The house, already silent by nature, seemed to have stopped in time. Not even the kitchen clock made a sound. It was as if the world had held its breath for a moment, and I alone hadn't noticed. I found myself there in the middle of the living room, holding a cold cup of tea, unsure if I had just woken up or was trapped in an endless nightmare. I glanced down the hallway, where my mother slept. The half-open door let out only the faint sound of her breathing. But even that sound seemed strange to me. as if it weren't hers. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly afraid. Not the fear of losing someone. I already knew that. But the fear of losing myself. I began to wonder if all of this was real. If the marks I saw, if Vanessa's gaze, if the photo of my grandmother. Was it all in my tired head? Was I, at 73, starting to confuse memories with reality? I went to the bathroom and closed the door slowly. I didn't want anyone to hear me. Not even my mother, even though I knew she barely spoke anymore. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. My eyes seemed smaller, deeper. My face bore a weariness that came not just from age, but from a lifetime of silent battles. I washed my face, as if the water could erase the insecurity. But it was still there. And with it, a lump in my throat I could no longer hide. I cried. I cried silently, like someone apologizing for falling apart. I lowered my head, leaned my forehead against the closet door, and let the tears fall, unhurriedly. It was an old pain, a sadness that had no name, but that had been with me since I was a child. As if I had been trained, my whole life, to be too strong. To endure everything in silence. And now, at this point in the journey, my soul seemed to be punishing me for having swallowed so much for so long. I returned to the bedroom and sat in the rocking chair. I stared at the ceiling for minutes that felt like hours. And then, without warning, I fell asleep. In the midst of my exhaustion, I was transported back to a time I had already buried. I dreamed of my grandmother. She was sitting in the kitchen of her old house, the one with the checkered floor and the pressure cooker humming in the background. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. I could feel the warmth of the cup in my hand, even in the dream. She looked at me as she always had, steadily, but tenderly. And it was in that look that I saw it. On her arm, bare because of the short-sleeved dress, was the mark. The same mark. I woke up startled, wet with sweat, with a feeling that the dream had only lasted a second. But it stayed with me, as if it had been real. I went straight to the box of old photos. Turning it over, my hands trembling, I found the image again. The same one that had frightened me days before. Only this time, I didn't just see the scar. I saw everything it represented. A pattern. An echo that spanned generations. Something unsaid, but that survived in the body, in memory, in pain. In that instant, my mindset shifted. Something in me stopped doubting and began to trust. Because certain truths don't need proof. They reveal themselves in the impact they cause. In the discomfort they provoke. And everything I felt wasn't made up. It was intuition. It was the kind of wisdom that only comes with years, with wear and tear, with the courage to look at what most pretend not to see. But along with this clarity came an even greater loneliness. Because I realized there was no point in waiting for someone to validate me. My children didn't want to know. Vanessa was following the same old script. And my mother was already too far away to tell me anything. Every day, she drifted a little further away. And I felt like an island, shouting into a sea that didn't hear. I wrote everything down again. This time with more precision. Even the time my mother yawned, the exact moment her eyes lost focus, the smell of the room when the nurse left. It was a way to keep myself sane, to organize the mess inside me. And somehow, it became my anchor. As if I knew that one day these records would be useful. That one day someone would need to see everything that was being hidden. On this journey, I learned that rock bottom isn't just a dark place. It's also a silent place. Where you hear more clearly the voices you once ignored. And it was there, in that silence that only pain brings, that I rediscovered parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. Strength, yes. But also vulnerability. And I understood that being strong isn't about not feeling. It's about feeling everything. And moving on. And it was in this state of broken but determined soul that something unexpected happened. A small detail, but one that would completely change the course of everything. It was one of those days when everything seemed grayer than usual. The light streamed through the window dully, as if even the sun were tired. I felt the weight of the week on my shoulders, of those marks that kept appearing on my mother's arm, of my son's indifference, of the nurse's coldness, and, most of all, of the doubt that grew inside me like a weed. I needed a breather. Something to tell me I wasn't going crazy. That my intuition was still valid. That my pain made sense. That's when I decided to go down to the basement. There was no clear reason, just that restlessness we feel when something needs to be found, even if we don't know what. The basement is old, damp, full of stacked boxes and forgotten memories. Every corner holds a piece of our history. Photos, letters, objects that have survived time and loss. It was like descending into the heart of family memory. I rummaged through Christmas boxes, my children's schoolbooks, and yellowed notes until I found a cardboard box older than the others, with a handwritten ribbon, Grandma Odette's things. The handwriting was my mother's. Just seeing that name made my heart sink. Grandma Odette was a powerful figure in my childhood. One of those women who knew everything about home remedies, who commanded more than the church priest, and who cooked as if she were feeding the world. I remember her with a scarf tied around her head, her hands always busy with something, and that look that pierced through you. A look that said everything without needing to say anything. I opened the box carefully. Inside were old photos, some so worn I could barely see their faces. There was also a small hardcover Bible, folded letters, and a rusty brooch. But it was one photograph in particular that stopped me in my tracks. It was a black and white image, clearly taken in a hospital setting. The iron bed, the white sheets, someone's lab coat in the background. And in the center, my grandmother, in a light-colored nightgown, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into the camera. But what stopped me was something else. On her arm, clearly visible, was a mark. The same mark. Same shape, same place, same color. I actually rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't imagining it. But it was there. Like a signature of fate. A sign that had crossed time and ended up in our hands again. I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. This couldn't be a coincidence. It was as if something was trying to show me that this pain wasn't just ours. It was ancient. A kind of hidden truth, hidden for generations, like a poorly buried secret. I sat there, on the dusty basement floor, and stared at the photo for long minutes. I remembered the smell of her morning coffee, the way she'd hold my face when she wanted to comfort me, the stories she'd tell about things we couldn't understand but that happened in families, from time to time. At the time, I thought it was an exaggeration. Now, I wonder if she already knew. It was as if all the loose pieces began to fall into place in an almost frightening way. That photo was more than a record. It was a warning. A call. Confirmation that I wasn't alone on this journey. And that, however confusing the situation, there was indeed a thread that connected everything. A thread made of pain, of memory, of blood, and of something that needed to be broken. I took the photo with me and climbed back up slowly. My head was spinning. My heart was pounding. But for the first time in days, I felt something stronger than doubt inside me. Certainty. The certainty that my grandmother had gone through something she never told us about. That my mother was going through it again. And that maybe I was the only one capable of breaking this cycle. Not just for my mother, but for all of us. That afternoon, I made coffee the same way my grandmother did. I used the same pot, the same measurements. I placed 2 cups on the table, even though I knew she wouldn't drink them all. And I sat there, with the photo in my hand, waiting for her to wake up. When I saw her coming from the bedroom, slowly, with a somewhat lost look in her eyes, I handed the photo to her without saying anything. She took it, stared at it for a few seconds, and then, her eyes filled with tears. It was the first time in weeks I'd seen emotion on her face. She said nothing. She just handed the photo back, placed her hand on mine, and remained silent. But in that gesture, I understood everything. She remembered. She knew. And even though she couldn't speak, she was telling me, "Go. Keep going. Find out what's behind this. That moment was like turning on a light in a dark room. The darkness didn't disappear, but now I knew where to walk. It wasn't just about suspecting Vanessa anymore. It was about delving into the depths of a pain no one had ever dared to face. And maybe, finally, understanding the true impact of it all. That night, after breakfast, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning over the photo of my grandmother in my head, as if she were calling me from somewhere far away. You know when your body is exhausted, but your soul is alert? That was it. I felt like I was about to discover something that would change everything. I just didn't realize the answer was closer than I thought, and that it would come in the most brutal way. The next morning, I decided I wouldn't watch silently any longer. I needed to act. Doubt was no longer doubt. It was conviction. Vanessa arrived at the same time as always, with the same rehearsed gestures. But there was something different about her. Perhaps a tired look in her eyes, perhaps fear beginning to show. She greeted me with a tense smile, like someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was already slipping through their fingers. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer afraid of appearing exaggerated, emotional, or out of my depth. I was lucid. More so than ever. I waited for the right moment. I didn't want to make a scene or put my mother at risk. But when Vanessa left the room after administering the medication and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, I followed behind. I closed the door. And I asked, my voice firm without trembling, "What exactly are you giving my mother?" She pretended not to understand. She tried to deflect. She said it was what the doctor prescribed. But I continued, staring. Because ever since you started giving her these medications, she's gotten worse. And now, I know this story has happened before. The same mark. The same reaction. The same pain. She tried to laugh. That cynical, mocking laugh that uses disbelief as a weapon. You've been seeing things, Mrs. Eleanor. You're getting impressed. But this time, I didn't let it go. I picked up the pill container. I read the names. And said, "These aren't the same ones that were here last week. And you know it." I took pictures of everything. It was at that moment that she lost control. The mask slipped. The forced calm shattered. She looked into my eyes, and for a second, I saw anger. The anger of someone who had been found out. The anger of someone who never imagined she would be challenged by a 73-year-old woman. Then she said in a lower tone, almost a whisper. She was agitated. It was supposed to help. I just adjusted the dose. My heart raced. Adjusted how? I asked. You're not the one prescribing anything. Her response was cold and cutting. No one will believe you. Not even your children will believe you. They'll say it's all in your head. You'll make a scene and end up alone. You'll lose what little sanity you have left. It hit like a blow. But it was also liberating. Because her threat felt like confirmation. She knew. And now I knew too. She was manipulating everything. It wasn't just the medication. It was the narrative. It was my image. She was constructing a story in which I was the unbalanced one. The exaggerated one. The confused old woman who sees ghosts. The anger I felt in that moment wasn't enough to scream. It was from within. The kind that simmers silently. I looked at her, took a deep breath, and said, "Maybe no one will believe me. But I'll do whatever it takes to prove it. Because what you're doing to my mother won't go unpunished." She didn't answer. She picked up her glass, turned, and left the kitchen. But I saw her step falter. I saw she hadn't expected this. For my firmness. For the courage that comes when we understand that love is stronger than fear. After she left, I sat on the couch and remained silent. I needed to think. I needed to decide what to do with that truth. Because now it wasn't just mine. It carried the weight of my mother, my grandmother, and all the women who had once been discredited, silenced, dismissed for being too emotional. It was a raw truth. And a dangerous one. But it was mine. And I wasn't going to let it slip away. I spent the day reviewing everything I'd written down. The photos, the times, the symptoms. I spoke with an acquaintance who works at a senior center. I told her part of what was happening and asked for guidance. She listened attentively and said something that has stuck with me. You need to gather evidence. We need details. Everything you can record. This could be much bigger than you think. And it was that sentence that lit me up again. Because until then, I thought it was just my mother. But what if it wasn't? What if this woman was doing this in other homes? In other families? What if her name hid a history that no one had the courage to investigate? It was no longer just personal. It was about justice. About responsibility. About protecting those who no longer have the strength to defend themselves. From that moment on, I knew what I needed to do. But I also knew I couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every step would be important. Every choice. Decisive. Because now it wasn't just about the marks on my mother's arm. It was about leaving marks on history. That night wasn't like any other. For the first time in a long time, I didn't cry, I didn't doubt myself, and I didn't lose sleep. I stayed awake, yes, but with my eyes wide open and my mind steady. It was as if the fear had gone, and in its place, a new strength had been born. The kind that only appears when you understand that no one else will fight for what's yours if you don't stand up for yourself. I went to the living room table and organized the papers, the notes, the schedules, the medicine labels, the dates. Every detail that had previously seemed small now had a greater meaning. It was all there. Everything Vanessa had tried to hide, disguise, or make seem normal. I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't a police officer, but I was a daughter. And that was enough. That woman had crossed the line. And when someone touches someone we love, something inside us changes forever. It's almost instinctive. It's more than courage. It's survival. The next morning, I called Solange, my cousin. We hadn't spoken much lately, but she'd always been trustworthy. She'd worked as a social worker for over 20 years and had seen a lot. I told her everything. From beginning to end. No embellishments. She was silent for a while, as if weighing each word. And then she replied, "You were right to contact me. This is serious. Very serious." She arranged to come by that same week, said she'd bring a recorder and some forms. We'd need to document everything carefully, quietly, but accurately. Those were her words. While I waited, I started recording what I could. I grabbed my phone, set it to silent, and hid it behind the potted plant in the living room, right next to the armchair where Vanessa usually sat when she gave her medicine. Was it risky? Yes. But it was necessary. I needed to capture the tone of her voice, the words she used, even the silences. Because sometimes, what says the most isn't what's said, it's what's avoided. In the days that followed, I became more attentive to everything. I began to notice details with a clarity that had previously eluded me. The way she held her water glass. The way she hurriedly wrote down the schedule. The way I avoided looking my mother in the eye. They were small things, but they spoke volumes. And as I recorded them, I felt a transformation within me. I was no longer the invisible lady of the house. She was no longer the grandmother left out at Sunday lunch. I was active. Awake. Ready. I remembered a phrase I heard many years ago when I was going through my divorce. You only discover your strength when you have no other option. And that was exactly it. I had no other option. To leave things as they were would be cowardly. To expect someone to come along with a magic solution would be naive. I needed to act. For myself. For my mother. And for my grandmother, who may not have had the same chance. I began discreetly talking to other caregivers in the area. I pretended to be looking for a replacement, asking about methods, procedures, and medications. One of them, unaware of what I already knew, mentioned a woman with a heavy hand who was changing prescriptions for frail elderly people to keep them calmer and more docile. They do it to avoid work, she said. It's easier when the patient sleeps all day. That sent a chill down my spine. This was it. This was exactly what was happening to my mother. At the end of the week, Solange came over. We sat in the kitchen, me, her, and a folder full of papers, audio files, printed photos, and jotted notes. She looked at everything carefully and professionally. Then she said, "You have more material than many cases we try to handle." That gave me a relief I can't describe. For the first time, someone believed in me, with evidence, with structure, with technical knowledge. And most importantly, with empathy. But more than any external validation, what sustained me now was something internal. A clarity that made me walk with a different posture. As if I'd left behind the version of myself that asked permission to be heard. Now, I spoke with firmness. And when you change within, the world begins to respond differently. Even Vanessa's tone seemed more cautious. As if she knew the terrain was no longer hers alone. My mother remained silent, but her eyes followed me differently. She noticed. She felt. And in that invisible bond between mother and daughter, something told me she knew, that I hadn't let it go. That, even without strength, she wasn't alone. That was what gave me the strength to carry on. Knowing that, even if no one else saw, she saw. Even if she didn't say it, she understood. And even if the world wanted to discredit me, her love was what sustained my truth. But I also knew this story wouldn't end there. What lay ahead would demand even more of me. Because when you decide to go all the way, when you start touching structures that function in silence and omission, there's no going back. And I was willing to follow this journey as far as necessary. Because now I was different. The news came without warning. It was a cloudy Thursday, the kind where the wind seems to bring more than just dry leaves. I was organizing my bedroom closet when the phone rang. It was Solange. Her voice carried a mixture of urgency and relief. "She's been removed, Eleanor. Officially. The complaint has been accepted." I was silent for a few seconds, clutching the phone like someone holding a hot secret. My heart raced, but not out of fear, out of justice. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't blind rage. It was the kind of reckoning that comes after much waiting, much humiliation, much resistance. Vanessa didn't show up the next day. Or the day after that. And when I learned from neighbors that she had been summoned to testify, I felt a strange peace wash over me. Peace and pain at the same time. Because even though she was no longer here, the scars she left didn't disappear overnight. I still see my mother's face, I still hear the words she never got to say, I still feel the heavy silence of when no one believed me. But now everything was beginning to take shape. Solange explained to me that, as she opened the case, new information emerged. Other families, other stories. Stories similar to what I experienced. Mysterious marks, unexplained medications, altered behaviors. A pattern. And most cruelly, all these families shared the same kind of pain we experienced here. Doubt. Loneliness. The shame of seeming exaggerated. The constant struggle to prove that love can also be lucid. The hidden truth began to reveal itself, as if a veil had been forcefully ripped away. Each new story that emerged was like an echo of what I'd experienced. A confirmation that what we call instinct is often ancestral wisdom. Something that spans generations, that lives within us. I listened to the stories and remembered the sleepless nights, the first time I saw the mark on my mother's arm, the coldness in Vanessa's eyes. And I thought, no one should have to go through this alone. Local newspapers began reporting on the case. Discreetly at first, but enough to attract attention. I saw a headline that read, "Caregiver removed due to suspicion of serial abuse." It was strange to read that. Because, for me, she wasn't just a headline. She was a face. A presence. A poison disguised as care. But there, printed in black and white, she was beginning to be exposed. And not by me, but by the facts. By the voices that had previously been silenced. by the evidence no one could ignore anymore. In this process, something inside me was also transforming. The woman who was once afraid of making mistakes, who hesitated before asking questions, who doubted her own memory, that woman was left behind. In her place grew someone with a different attitude, with a different mindset. A new awareness that aging doesn't mean weakening. That being a mother, a grandmother, a caregiver, is also being a guardian of truth. And that courage often resides in the silent insistence of those who refuse to give up looking pain in the eye. I remember one of those mornings. I went out to sweep the yard. The wind was lighter, the air seemed cleaner. And when I finished, I looked up at the sky. The clouds were slowly drifting away, as if even they knew something had changed. And then, without thinking, I said softly, "What you put out, comes back." It was a loose phrase, but full of meaning. A prayer without religion. An acknowledgement that, sooner or later, life takes care of returning what each of us gives to the world. Since Vanessa was removed, my mother seems more present. She still speaks little, but her eyes are no longer so dull. Sometimes she looks at me and holds my hand longer. And in that touch, I feel gratitude. I also sense an apology she might not even know how to express. For not speaking up sooner, for accepting so much in silence. But I understand. Because this generation has learned to swallow everything. To smile on the outside while the world crumbles on the inside. There are days when I still wake up in the middle of the night. My heart races, the feeling that something needs to be done. But now, I wake up differently. With a different kind of strength. Because I know I'm no longer fighting just for my home, for my mother. I'm fighting for all the voices that have yet to be heard. For all the buried stories. For all the women who once believed that suffering in silence was the only choice. The journey isn't over. There are still unanswered questions, ongoing procedures, letters that need to be written. But today, when I look in the mirror, I see someone who faced the impossible and didn't back down. Who didn't keep quiet when everything told him to. Who transformed pain into decision. And if there's one thing I've learned along this road, it's that the truth may take a while. But when it arrives, it takes everything with it. The phone rang late in the afternoon. The light was already weakly streaming in through the living room window, casting an orange hue over everything, as if the day were gently saying goodbye. I answered it unhurriedly, thinking it was some ordinary call, perhaps a distant relative asking about my mother. But the voice on the other end made me shiver. It was her. Vanessa. For a second, silence hung heavy between us. Her breathing was uneven, as if she was struggling with her own words. It was no longer the steady, controlled voice of someone skilled in manipulation. It was the sound of someone broken. Someone finally facing the consequences of what she had built in silence. And then she began to speak. She said she had lost her job. That they were investigating her other services. That some families had confirmed what we already knew. And that now she was being sued. Her voice trembled. There was something between desperation and an attempt to justify the unjustifiable. I never meant any harm. I just couldn't take it anymore. It was too much. Too much pressure. I messed up. But no one understands what we go through in this job. Sometimes, we just want everything to calm down. She was crying. But it wasn't the kind of crying that comes from guilt. It was the crying of someone who fears losing everything, not of someone who understands what they've caused. And as she spoke, I listened in silence. Without interrupting. Without reacting. I let her say what she wanted, because I knew that, this time I would have the last word. When she finally stopped, I took a deep breath. And with the calm that pain had taught me, I replied, "You scarred my mother on the outside. But it was on the inside that hurt the most. And that, not even time will erase." On the other end of the line, silence. There was nothing to say. Because that sentence, simple and direct, carried everything. All the frustration, all the helplessness, all the love. I didn't shout. I didn't wish harm. But I also didn't offer comfort. Because sometimes, the greatest strength comes at the boundary between forgiveness and the limit. And I knew exactly where that boundary lay. She hung up soon after, without another word. And there, with the phone still in my hand, I realized the cycle was ending. Not with spectacle, not with applause, but with dignity. The same dignity my mother always had, even when her voice failed her. The same dignity my grandmother carried, even when her body no longer obeyed. And now, it was my turn to honor that. In the days that followed, the house felt lighter. Not because the pain disappeared, but because it now had a name. It had a story. It had closure in the making. Vanessa's absence wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. It was as if her presence had left a shadow, and now, little by little, light was returning to the corners of the house where before there had been only tension. My mother experienced small improvements. Some days she slept better. Others, she smiled when I played her favorite song. These were small gestures, but they were powerful. Because when the soul is wounded, healing doesn't come quickly. It comes slowly, in the time of memory, in the time of the body. And every step she took toward presence was also a step for me. Because our connection always went beyond words. It was always made of looks, of touches, of intuitions that only a daughter and a mother can understand. Getting back to my routine was also a process. The wound was still there, but now open to the air. And when we expose a wound to the light, it stops festering. It begins to heal. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. What I did was for love, for justice, for something that transcends logic. And the most curious thing was realizing how some people started to look at me differently. The same people who had previously called me exaggerated now asked if I needed help, if everything was okay. Some even apologized, albeit timidly. But I held no grudges. Because I, too, have kept quiet out of fear. I've doubted myself. I've chosen silence because I thought no one would listen. So, seeing those looks change, I understood that perhaps my role was also to show that it's possible to turn things around. With patience, with truth, with courage. Solange called me the other day. She said the case is moving forward. That new testimonies have been added. That the case has become an example within the institution where she works. She thanked me. But I was the one thanking her. For listening, for being there, for being firm when I was about to break down. Because every strong woman at some point has needed someone to remind her of who she is. Today, when I walk through the living room and see the armchair where my mother used to sit motionless, empty for a few minutes while she rests in her room, I stop. I stop and give silent thanks. Not because everything has been resolved, because it hasn't yet. But for having had the strength to face it. For not letting myself be silenced. For being a voice, even though I was trembling. And for knowing that, now, nothing will make me turn back. Because after you face an abyss and don't fall, you learn that the impossible was just another name for fear. As the weeks passed, something beautiful began to happen inside that house that had for so long been a scene of tension and silence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those watching from the outside, but for me it was like watching spring arrive after a long winter. My mother, little by little, was returning. Not spectacularly or cinematically. Not the way we see in movies, with background music and tears falling at the right time. It was simple, genuine, the way real life is. The new caregiver arrived with a shy smile and a respectful way of walking around the house, as if asking permission to even breathe. Her name was Isabella. Young, attentive, but without the air of superiority the other one carried. She sat next to my mother unhurriedly, speaking softly, patiently, as if speaking to a child who has already seen the whole world. And my mother, for the first time in a long time, didn't seem to shy away from this contact. The first week, I noticed no visible changes. But the second, my mother held my hand while I played an old song. It was a song from the 1950s, the kind she used to hum while making lunch. She didn't sing, but closed her eyes and shook her head slightly, as if the sound had touched some forgotten place inside her. And I realized, there was still life there. There was still memory, sensitivity, emotion. Marks on her arms slowly began to fade. Her skin lightened, returning to its natural tone. Those bruises, which had once seemed to scream for help, now faded as if they had finally been heard. And I knew it wasn't just physical. It was energetic. It was emotional. Her body responded to the change of environment, to the absence of threat, and, most of all, to the presence of genuine care. In this process, I also began to heal. Because when we're on constant alert, the soul enters a state of survival and forgets to feel. It even forgets to breathe deeply. I spent months sleeping with one eye open, my heart pounding, and the feeling that everything could get worse at any moment. Now, little by little, I started hearing the normal sounds of the house again. The clock, the kettle, the birds outside. Things that had previously gone unnoticed, but which now reminded me that the world was turning on its own time again. Isabella began preparing small snacks with my mother. Simple things, like butter cookies and apple cinnamon tea. And in one of those moments, my mother spoke a word I hadn't heard from her mouth in months. "Thank you." Softly, almost whispered, but with a clarity that made my eyes well up. It was then that I felt my decision, however difficult and lonely it had been, was the right one. Because the truth isn't always comfortable, but it liberates. And in that freedom, my mother found space to be herself again. I also saw myself transforming. I no longer blamed myself for past doubts. I no longer judged myself for delaying action. I understood that each step was necessary to strengthen me, to face the truth with courage, even when no one agreed with me. And that's when I understood one of the most important lessons of this journey. Our truth resides in places not always visible to others. Sometimes the soul sees before the body, before logic, before evidence. One day, sitting on the porch, with my mother sleeping in the bedroom and Isabella washing dishes in the kitchen, I closed my eyes for a few seconds and thought, how many women must be going through this right now, without a voice, without support, without the strength to fight. And my heart ached. But it ached with purpose. Because I knew that telling this story wasn't just an act of remembrance. It was an act of resistance, of reparation, of hope. This experience changed me. It brought back parts of myself I hadn't even remembered existed. The woman who walks through this house today is firmer, more attentive, more connected to her own intuition. I learned that respecting what the heart feels isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Because the mind may doubt, but the heart, when it hurts, is almost always right. And when it insists, when it throbs, when it tightens, it's because it's trying to warn us of something the eyes can't yet see. My mother sleeps more peacefully now. Some days she wakes up and asks if it's Sunday yet. Other days, she just smiles. But there's a new sparkle in her eyes. A light that didn't come from the medication, but from relief. From security. And that, to me, is worth more than any rational explanation. Because the pain she felt, no one can erase. But the dignity she regained, no one can take that away. Ultimately, I think life gives us these challenges not only to test us, but to teach us to see more deeply. The enemy isn't always where everyone sees it. Sometimes it hides in what seems right, reliable, and trained. And that's why we need to trust our sensitivity. It's the first to notice what's out of place. The other day, Isabella asked me if I wanted to write down everything I'd been through. She said other women might need to hear it. And in that moment, I realized I was already doing it, even without pen and paper. Because every time I sit down, remember, speak, I'm giving voice not only to my story, but to the stories of so many others who have been kept hidden, who have been silenced, who have been discredited for being too sensitive. And if there's one thing I've learned forever, it's this: don't ignore what your heart feels. Sometimes your soul sees what your eyes can't. And when that happens, the wisest thing to do is stop, listen, and have the courage to follow that calling, even if no one else sees what you see. Because it's in that moment, exactly that transformation begins. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because some part of this story resonated with you. And maybe, like me, you felt like no one was listening to your heart. So, if this video touched something deep inside you, if it made sense, if it brought back some memory or courage, subscribe to the channel. Because here, every story is a reminder that we're not alone, and that our voices matter. Take advantage and leave a comment below. I'm with you until the end. That way, I know you felt every part of this journey with me. And look, your like makes a difference too. It's what shows YouTube that this kind of content deserves to reach more people who need to hear it. Oh, and there's a video right here that complements this conversation in a way you'll quickly understand. Click and stay with me there. We still have a lot to share.